Welcome all. My name is David Mirhady, and on behalf of the Mirhady family down here, I'd like to welcome you all this evening. This is a lecture, and I don't think we want it disturbed, so I'll ask you to turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so already. With those two things having been said, it's my responsibility to introduce my dean, Professor Leslie Cormack, who is going to bring us greetings on behalf of the university.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katharine Mirhady and the Mirhady family, it's my great pleasure as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences to welcome you to the 8th annual Dr. Fereidoun and Katharine Mirhady Endowed Lecture in Iranian Studies. Our visiting lecturer tonight is Dr. Ervand Abrahamian, the Distinguished Professor of Iranian History at Baruch College and the City. He is the author of numerous books which have altered the way we think of modern Iran. The Mirhady Endowed Lecture has, in its 8 years, brought to Vancouver scholars of great significance. It speaks to the importance and popularity of the lecture series that each of these lectures has attracted a full house, and tonight is no exception. I really welcome you here. Over the years, to mention just a few, we have had Professor Hamid Dabashi of Columbia University speaking on the cultural complexities of the epic poet Fereidoun. Professor Roy Motahedeh of Harvard University has given us a glimpse into the strange and marvelous imagery of classical Iranian art and literature. Professor Abbas Aminat from Yale University has spoken to the history of the toleration of nonconformity in Greater Iran. And Professor Asaneh Najmabadi, reflecting on issues of science and gender in contemporary Iran. Last year, Professor Dick Davis of Ohio State University, the translator of the magical novel My Uncle Napoleon, spoke on the importance of the Viz and Raman epic for Persian self-understanding. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I'd like to express my appreciation of the generosity of Dr. Katharine Mirhady and the late Dr. Fereidoun Mirhady for making these lectures possible. The initial goal of their endowed lecture was to reinforce the sense of community among Iranians while informing non-Iranians about the rich and important Persian tradition in all its diversity. And I think it's done that over and over. I think it's been a wonderful success in its initial idea. The lecture series, as I say, has done this very well, and we hope to use this inspiration to expand the study of the Persian language and Iranian societies and cultures at our university. This fits well, I believe, the commitment of the university and my own faculty for the expansion of international programs at Simon Fraser University. We invite you all to be a part of the future for Iranian studies. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Daryl McLean, one of the founders of our Middle East program in history, the coordinator of the Mirhady Endowed Lecture, and the director of SFU's Center for the Comparative Study of Muslim Societies and Cultures. Daryl is such an important character, that's not a good way to put that, is such an important contributor to these wonderful lectures and to the vibrancy of the work that is done at this university in Middle Eastern and Muslim societies and cultures. Dr. McLean will introduce this evening's speaker. Daryl?
Thank you very much, Leslie, and I think perhaps character is the word you were searching for. It's a real pleasure once again to be able to echo the Dean's appreciation of the Mirhady family and their contribution, their long-standing contribution to Iranian studies here at Simon Fraser University. It's hard to imagine that it's been 8 years. They've gone by very quickly. But I think they've been important 8 years. They've brought here scholars of international stature, topics ranging widely over time, over place, over subject. For me, at least, it's become abundantly clear from these lectures that the contribution of Persian-speaking societies is important not only to Iran, but much beyond Iran. It matters in many ways to the ways in which we think of this world. I have also been very pleased with the ongoing and very generous response of the Iranian Canadian community here in Vancouver to our programs at the university, especially through the donations of Farsi language books to our library. Every year over the last 8 years, I've noted some of these donations, and I want to today as well. This year has seen 2 significant donations of Farsi books. One of these is a donation of some 800 books by Mrs. Lami Nasrpour. It is an important collection, especially rich in works of history, memoirs, both political and literary, philosophy, and literature. Just to mention a few items, this includes the Lughatname of Dehuda, not in a reprint, but in its complete 49-volume original edition. This is, of course, for most of you know, a classic of Persian lexicography and a welcome addition to our library. A Rumi collection of over 30 volumes, including not only the major works of Rumi, but several important commentaries, including the difficult-to-find commentary of Kashafi. A Hafiz collection. Hafiz is not surprising in a library, but a Hafiz collection of over 30 books, noteworthy for major commentaries, not just the poetry, the commentaries of Ghani and Mu'in and Bukhari and Haravi. Most of these books have already been cataloged and are in the library. But I've placed a few that remain. They're not the best of the books. They're the ones that have remained to be cataloged on the table outside, and some of you may have had a chance to see them this evening as you were waiting to come in. They may well be there after, and I urge you to take a look at them. The other Farsi collection was gifted to our library only 2 weeks ago by Dr. Monir Taha, and it's particularly strong in works of contemporary Farsi poetry in the diaspora, as we would expect, of course, from the remarkable stature of Dr. Taha as a poet. I've only just now begun to look through this collection, but I noted last week several volumes of the journal Bahar, which I'm sure some of you may have read, an important modernizing journal published in the 1920s by Yusuf Ihtisham al-Mulk. The journal is notable for a number of its essays, but especially its groundbreaking reflections on the rights of Iranian women. It rightfully belongs in our library, and I'm pleased to see it. Our Iranian Studies program is grateful for this continuing support of our library. It has gone from, I hate to admit this, no Farsi books 10 years ago, none, to almost 3,000, and major books. And I'm hoping we can continue that movement every year until we build up a collection here at Simon Fraser University of the major works in Farsi. We also hope for continuing support in other areas, especially, as the Dean noted, as we work at Simon Fraser University to establish not simply Farsi language instruction, but quality Farsi language instruction on an ongoing basis. I thank you for your help in this. It's now my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, the distinguished recipient of the 8th Doctors Fereidoun and Katharine Mirhady Endowed Lectureship, Professor Ervand Abrahamian, University Professor of Iranian History at Baruch College in the City University of New York. Dr. Abrahamian commanded the attention of this year's lecture committee as the most prominent and authoritative historian concerned with the critical social history of modern Iran. Born in Iran and educated in England at Oxford University and in New York at Columbia University, Dr. Abrahamian's writings have set the standard for history from below in Iran. His 6 books and numerous articles have ranged widely over the major issues of 20th century Iran, becoming in the process foundational for those who study this period. Qajar and Pahlavi despotism, the role of the Iranian crowd assigned in our class this year, the emergence of an Iranian intelligentsia, the complex development of progressive movements, and especially the nuanced analysis of Iranian revolutions. And I use the word in the plural, the Constitutional Revolution, Pahlavi Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, perhaps the Reform Revolution. In so doing, he has become a major architect for our understanding of the social margins and class origins of Iran's modernity. His most recent book is A History of Modern Iran, published to much critical acclaim just last year by Cambridge University Press. What Dr. Abrahamian accomplishes here is nothing less than magisterial, infusing a lifetime of thought about Iran into a series of subtle yet always intense and committed arguments. In the process, he provides us with a deep appreciation of just how Iran has arrived at the present complex and important juncture. As Edward Mortimer of the Salzburg Global Seminar has said of this book and of this author, and I quote, "Ervand Abrahamian has done for Iran what de Tocqueville did for France." We are fortunate indeed to be able to consider Professor Abrahamian's reflections this evening on the very, very timely topic of show trials in Iran. There will be a question period following the lecture and a reception in the foyer outside the lecture thereafter. But please join me in welcoming Professor Abrahamian.
Thank you for that introduction. I'd like to thank the university for inviting me, and I would also like to thank the Mirhady family for endowing this series of lectures on Iran. Originally, I was planning to talk about the 1953 coup and the oil crisis of 51-53. But because of recent events in Iran, I was distracted, and I thought I would be better off talking about something more topical than things in the 1950s. And what drew my attention was, of course, the staging of show trials after the June elections and the protests. So instead of talking about 51, 53, I'm going to actually talk about show trials that took place recently and compared them to show trials that happened in the early 1980s. Now, Hegel once remarked that history, to have meaning, repeats itself. And Marx added that, yes, history repeats itself, but once as a tragedy and second time more as a farce. This remark is especially apt for these show trials in Iran. In the 1980s, they were grim tragedies, high dramas, high intensity of emotion, often ending in executions or suicide or deaths, sudden deaths in prison. The recent ones were more in the form of a farce, admittedly a farce in bad taste. They began with much fanfare, with some 100 defendants in the dock, many of them very prominent figures. I included a former vice president, a former deputy minister, a chief electoral strategist for the Khatami period, a leader of the occupation of the US Embassy, the chief negotiator that ended the 440-day hostage crisis, and a number of well-known journalists. A few unknown mujahideen and monarchists were also thrown into the dock, mainly probably for good measure, but as a way of, I think, tarnishing the reform movement with these external opposition groups. The trials, however, soon stuttered and petered out with lame and often incoherent confessions. Some defendants never gave confessions. Some refrained from saying anything significant. Others repeated the official line that the West wanted a velvet revolution and merely apologized for having made the mistake of having been unwitting partners to this attempt of soft revolution. One journalist confessed and apologized to President Ahmadinejad for having waged a psychological war against him. What was his psychological war? He had written articles in the newspaper critical of his financial policies. The highlight of the trial was when the chief defendant, in a long and incoherent statement, declared, quote, "I think there is a capacity for what the deputy prosecutor called the Velvet Revolution, but I don't know if the intention was there or not." Hajarian, who was one of the main figures in the trial and the former strategist for Khatami, had his confession read for him because he was paralyzed from neck down from a previous assassination attempt on him. In his supposed confession, he admitted to the high crime of, quote, having misanalyzed the chances of the reform movement in the 2009 election. Now, the regime gave little publicity to these so-called confessions. Relatives denounced them as false, coerced, inauthentic. The two main opposition candidates described them as medieval inquisitions. Their general reaction both abroad and at home was sympathy for the defendants. Some defendants were given suspended sentences and released. Some were given light sentences. So far, only one has actually received a long sentence. For adjunct professor of Columbia University was given 12 years. These sentences are also to be reviewed, so they will probably be reduced, and I suspect most of them will be out of prison fairly soon. So in short, what were billed as major show trials have turned out to be no more like no-show trials. Now, the question I would like to pose is why this difference between the 1980s and 2009? What does this difference mean for our understanding of how Iran has changed in the course of the last 25, 30 years? From the standpoint of 2009, Iran of the early 1980s seems to be truly a foreign country. In other words, by comparing these show trials, I would like to explore the changes that have occurred in the political culture, as political scientists would say, or as the French Annales School would say, the mentalité of the country in the last quarter century. Now, the show trials in the 1980s were almost a daily occurrence. From 1981 to 85, almost every day on television, they were what was billed as public eterafat, a term that could mean both confession and recantation. Prominent members, many of them often household names, were brought before the media and forced to recant their former ideas and confess to a host of sins and high crimes. The victims came from a wide spectrum of political life, from the far right through the center to the far left. Among the luminaries that came before the cameras were General Fereidoun, Shah's childhood friend and confidant, who for years had headed the Special Inspectorate, which was a sort of a savak within a savak. They included associates of Bazargan, the liberal prime minister, and Khomeini's first provisional prime minister. They included Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari, one of the most senior clerics of the time, Sadr Qutbzadeh, who was Khomeini's main advisor and translator in Paris. They included other figures you may not have heard of, but it was very important at the time. Tahir Ahmadzadeh, a prominent liberal Muslim who'd spent years in the Shah's prisons and immediately after revolution was appointed governor of Khorasan. They also included some staunch Khomeinis, who for one reason or another had fallen by the wayside. Men such as Mehdi Hashemi, a close political and family friend of Ayatollah Montazeri, who was at that time the heir designate to Mossadegh, to Khomeini. Of course, the programs gave high prominence to leftists, not just to Maoists and Trotskyists, but especially to two-day leaders, since many of them were household names. People like Kianuri, who for a few months earlier had actually publicly debated some of the prominent figures of the Republic on television. Other prominent intellectuals like Tabari, Beazin, people who had been well known in literary circles all the way from the 1940s period. And they also include a group of military officers who had spent some quarter of a century in prison. In fact, some of them have been in prison longer than Mandela had been in South Africa. In addition to these luminaries, a long array of smaller fry from the Mujahideen, Fereidoun, both majority and minority faction, as well as other radical groups were paraded before the cameras. One could very well say that Iranian television became an equal opportunity media, with almost every group being represented in these eterafat. Now, these shows were not only put on television, they were put, of course, we did prison and closed circuit television within the main prisons. The transcripts were printed and reprinted in newspapers in pamphlet form. Some major recantations were then also published as memoirs in book form. And some, in fact, videos were even circulated in consulates abroad, so as many Iranians could get exposure to these confessions. One can actually say that Iran outdid any other regime in history in the production of public recantations. Such recantations had taken place, obviously, places like Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, Eastern Europe in the 1950s, the medieval Inquisition, 16th century monarchies in Western Europe, but none actually could compete with Iran in this mass production of public confessions. Of course, the introduction of television, new technology, television and videos partly explains why Iran could basically resort to such methods more than the others. Now, although these regimes vastly differ in time, space, and shape and form, they all managed to actually produce recantations that bear uncanny similarities. The central message in all these recantations is to reaffirm the gospel according to the regime, reflect and reinforce the image of reality projected by the regime, and reassure the general public that the ideas propagated by the authorities are thoroughly true, and the ideas they themselves had propagated in the past were equally false. The central theme of all these texts, not just in Iran, but in the other countries and historical times, dwelled not only how the victim had been led astray in the past, but emphasized the superiority of the official ideology, the superiority above all competing ideologies. Terms that constantly keep coming in all these confessions are words such as repentance, redemption, second chance, cautionary tale, reflections on past errors, treason, betrayal, deviation from the straight and narrow path. And what they stress is the need for ideological conformity. And they also stress the dangers of the hidden foreign hand. Besides recanting previous convictions, they also basically stress that they have discovered the truth and they have found the errors of their ways by being in prison. They thank the wardens for the kindness and considerations and ask the leaders and the nation for forgiveness so that they can try to reintegrate themselves back into the community. So the phrases that constantly come up, besides the ones I mentioned, are, quote, straying from the straight and narrow path, veils being lifted from one's eyes, the prison being an educational institution where we can study and learn the truth from books and literature. Now, these recantations are very similar because they all carry the same central message, but they also were given in context that do have two common features. So in all these very different type of regimes, there are two common features that I think help explain the content of these recantations. One is the fear of the foreign hand, a paranoid fear that the hidden hand, in some cases a foreign power, in the cases of actually in the early modern period, witches actually and Satan himself are the threat. Secondly, a highly charged ideological environment. In the 1980s of Iran, the public recantations were effective in most part because these two factors actually were very present. One, the country lived in a perpetual fear of foreign conspiracies, whether by the US, Britain, or the Soviet Union. The revolution seemed highly insecure. 1953 still cast a long shadow. The notion of a communist, quote, fifth column was very much alive, and it was easy to link opponents of the regime to either the US, Britain, or Russia. In one case where you couldn't actually make this link, which is the case of Mehdi Hashemi, who was a Khomeinist, Interestingly enough, that case comes the closest to more early modern witch hunts, where Mehdi Hashemi doesn't admit to having links to a foreign entity, but he actually admits that his carnal, quote, carnal instincts that had led him to having a relationship with actually Satan himself. Someone of the Inquisition would have found this very familiar. And in his confession, he even says that he had, because of this connection, he found the means of actually inducing cancer in his opponents. Somewhat mind-boggling how scientifically this could be explained. But this confession actually was taken all the way to Khomeini. He viewed it before it was aired on public television. And this was one of the more sensational confessions of the time. Now, besides, of course, this foreign threat existing at the time, the 1980s was also a highly charged ideological time. The country had not only gone through a tumultuous revolution, but also Islam had been consciously developed by intellectuals such as Shariati to be a comprehensive ideology, an ideology that could compete with other ideologies, particularly with Marxism and secular humanism. So consequently, if you have such a sort of rivalry in terms of ideology, it was seen as a major coup to actually force or get people from the rival ideology to come to the television and admit that they were mistaken and Islam was in fact a superior ideology. After some of the two-day recantations, one senior cleric, Hojati Kermani, in fact said, quote, I have known Mr. Amouni. He's one of the military officers who spent 25 years in prison. I have known him from prison. He was a true believer in Marxism. He considered the two-day to be the whole life of his family, his father, his mother, his wife, his child. His recantation signifies the total triumph of Islam over Marxism. Such a show shows that Islam is far superior to the other rival ideologies. Two other factors help explain the potency of these recantations of the 1980s. One is the general public was on the whole unaware of the stage preparations that went actually into the production of these shows. In Iran at that time, books such as Orwell's 1984 had been published, but generally not read, and they were usually dismissed by intellectuals as actually being Cold War propaganda. It didn't help, actually, that Orwell's work was published in Iran by a publishing house that was actually linked with the CIA, so sometimes paranoia it comes true. Another factor was the attentive public, or the politically active community, who were aware of some of these methods that were used. For them, being forced to confess or recant was seen as a weakness, not only the weakness of the person, but also a weakness of the ideology. The word was often used that the person is shekaste, broken, because they had, in fact, submitted. The general notion was that one's supposed to die rather than submit or to recant. The ideal here that was held up culturally is a poem written by Ahmad Shamlou, who is one of the major poets of the time. In fact, I would say one of the greatest poets of 20th century Iran. His poem it's entitled Vartan's Death. And the refrain through the poem is, Vartan refused to talk. Vartan was a radical who was tortured to death after the 53 coup, and here the ideal was being held that it was better to die rather than talk or confess or recant. Similarly, there was an incident in the last years of the Shah's reign that reinforced this sort of cultural idea of bravado, of heroism. These were two intellectuals who were tried among a group of some 20 intellectuals, named Gul Sorki and Daneshan. These two sealed their faith at their trial because instead of submitting and recanting, they actually used the platform of the trial to denounce the Shah and publicly reaffirm their commitment to Marxism. So in the highly charged ideological atmosphere of the revolutionary period, these two were held up as exemplary figures. In fact, the last few years of the Shah's reign, it was hard to get a poem passed through the censors if it used the word Gul because of Gul Sorki, because the association would be that people would remember these two sort of heroes. So these were the models held up. So anyone then recanting after a few years later was seen as not being able to uphold the revolutionary models of these earlier heroes. Now, fast forward to 2009. When the unexpected crisis erupted after the June 2009 elections, the immediate reaction, one could almost say the knee-jerk reaction of the regime, was to resort to this old tactic of public recantations. To paraphrase Marx, the authorities borrowed from the past, conjured up old images, donned worn-out appearances, but ended up parodying history. They announced with much fanfare that they would put on mass trials where the prosecutor and defendants would prove to the public that the whole crisis had been planned, masterminded, and funded by foreign powers eager to bring about a velvet revolution, in line with the soft or colored revolutions of Eastern and Central Europe. The government claimed that these recantations would prove beyond any doubt that the opposition in Iran was intricately linked to the, quote, hidden foreign hand, and that the public protests of over 1 million in the streets were all masterminded from abroad by foreign powers and foreign entities, especially Soros and Open Society, who the government claimed was working hand in hand with the CIA. We held our breaths for another round of sensational shows. Instead, we got these half-hearted recantations, some press conferences, a poorly organized mass trial, intermittent prison sentences varying from a few months to a few years, and the trials appear to have boomeranged on the regime, creating more sympathy for the victims than for the authorities. Why this contrast with the 1980s? Well, one can identify three major trends that have brought about, I think, fundamental change in the political culture of the country. One, the paranoid style has obviously diminished. Iran did have a successful revolution. US was kicked out, and as Khomeini said in less picturesque language, the US can't do a damn thing. The present regime also bills itself as a major power. With all this basically accepted, then it's hard to imagine Iran as a poor victim that can easily be manipulated by Soros or the United States. Moreover, of course, the Soviet Union no longer exists, so that fifth column is no longer there. And Britain, of course, is really not a major power, but a large commercial enterprise. The regime may raise the hue and cry about foreign conspiracies, but they tend to ring hollow for much of the public by 2009. They, in fact, sound more like a broken record. In the period of liberalization under Khatami in the 1990s, in fact, a number of journals in Iran made fun of the whole idea of these conspiracy theories, and the term was coined totegari, basically that it was a sort of a pure funny tendencies of Iranians to look for conspiracies when there weren't any. Of course, there are still people such as editors of Kayhan and Endowed who are looking for conspiracies, not CIA conspiracies, but also Freemason conspiracies, Zionist conspiracies, and so on. But I think for the more aware public, this sounds like old men repeating old ideas. It really is no longer in tune for much of the younger generation at the present time. A second factor that has changed is, of course, the ideological intensity has diminished. The leading intellectuals of the Muslim Islamic movement, people like Soroush, have constantly tried to trim down Islam from what they call a bloated, comprehensive ideology. They've tried to trim it to what becomes for really a issue of personal ethics, of how people should, in their personal relations, deal with others. The whole reform movement, the Islamic reform movement, no longer sees Islam as being the solution to all problems. Marxism is no longer is no longer seen as a mortal threat. In fact, at the beginning of the recent trials, the prosecutor named the main threat to the Islamic Republic not Marx or Engels or Stalin. He named the main threat as coming from Max Weber, Habermas, post-structuralism, and feminism. Hajarian, actually, as one of the main defendants, asked forgiveness because he said he had been led to misunderstand the Iranian social situation by reading Habermas and Max Weber. In the old days, I can imagine people checking their bed before going to bed, worried about Marxists or Maoists there threatening them, but I don't think Max Weber or Habermas somehow fit that bill. A third factor, I think, that has changed the situation is since the late 1980s, especially through the 90s where the reform period started, much more information got to the public about the mechanisms that went into the production of these shows. You had reams of memoirs written by former political prisoners, the ones who had survived, who got out of the country, especially to Germany, generated, I would say, a whole genre of prison literature. There are about 100 now memoirs of prison literature, and within that is actually another genre of women former prisoners with their literature. And much of this very much depicts and really is eyewitness accounts of the horrors of prison life in the 1980s. In addition, two prominent members of Bazargan's liberal Muslim movement, Behbahani and Davaran, were subjected to this process, and they actually published their experiences in a book called Guests of Haji Agha. And this was in fact published and circulated in the country during the Khatami liberal period. Another person, Amir Entezam, another was Bazargan associate, smuggled out of prison a series of letters basically depicting what he had seen in the prisons. Another person, Sarkouhi, editor of an independent leftist paper, Adine, was also abducted and forced to make confessions about himself and his colleagues. In it, he had to basically implicate a number of his colleagues in illicit sexual liaisons as a way of basically destroying their personalities. But before the authorities could release his confession, he actually got a letter out through friends saying that the whole confession was false. He had been forced to lie, and that he, in fact, would have said anything to get out of there. So, in fact, here you see a cultural change that instead of saying, well, better death than confess, he was willing to say, I will confess to anything. It really doesn't mean anything because it's a forced confession, and therefore people should not take it too seriously. And of course, he didn't consider himself as losing his face or his aberu, his honor, by submitting to this process. Also, in the 1990s, the Reform Majlis actually passed 100 bills for trying to open up the system. And among the bills were a number of clauses that were explicitly ruled out use of coercion in prisons. And that any such confessions would not be used in actual courts, would not be used as evidence. Of course, these bills were not did not go through the Guardian Council, but the fact that they were discussed, debated, got into the public arena. People were much more aware of what was going on behind the scenes. Similarly, a report by the judiciary in 2005 admitted that in the past, torture had been usually used in prisons to extract false confessions. And Khatami himself admonished the judiciary for having used, quote, wrong methods to extract confessions. Here, he obviously was trying to avoid the T word and talking about wrong methods. Now, what were the methods that were used in the preparation of these shows? The answer is, of course, a very simple one word, torture. But here you find that the regime has actually striking similarities with the Bush administration in that it could, with an honest face and a straight face, say it was not using torture by linguistic turn, by defining torture in such a way that the practices it resorted to would not fall into that definition of torture. I don't know how far you followed the U.S. Vets in the last few years, but the Bush administration was insisting that they were not using torture, hoping that no one would find out what their definition of torture was. But their definition of torture was leaked out. It wasn't supposed to be leaked out. And the definition of torture they used was inflicting intentional pain with the intensity to cause a death or organ failure. Of course, in good English, this would be murder, not torture. In fact, the classical definition of torture from Roman times is the infliction of pain to get the other person to do or say what you want. It's nothing to do, actually, the whole purpose is not to kill the person, but to get them to do what you want. So similarly, in Iran, for the regime, what they practiced was not torture, because the way they define torture, and they could say, well, we can't use torture because the Constitution actually has a clause saying torture cannot be used. And since they're the guardians of the Constitution, logically it follows that they couldn't use torture since they're guarding the Constitution. But for them, torture is what Savak often resorted to, which was a use of mechanical machines and electricity to get people to talk. And as long as they didn't use this, for them this was not torture. A student of mine recently was in Tehran and tried to visit a museum that was established right after the revolution, a museum of torture. But it was always closed. In the enthusiasm in '79, they'd set up this museum, but obviously it doesn't fit into the present atmosphere. But what they were doing in terms of language, is they were defining torture as use of mechanical processes, but what they actually practiced, which is whipping, lashing, for them was not torture, that was the ta'zir, discretionary punishment. So, but of course, according to the Sharia, whipping is a legitimate, long-practiced way of punishment. So the procedure was for the interrogator to ask the prisoner a question, and if the question was not satisfactory, then the interrogator could sentence the prisoner to 15 lashes, 60 lashes, whatever number of lashes, and then ask the question again. And then if the question was again not satisfactory, you would get another round of lashes until, of course, then the prisoner gave the right answer, i.e. the truth, and then, of course, the lashes would cease. And this would all be meticulously kept to the legal process because it would be done on the clerical supervision. Either the interrogator would have some judicial training, or they would be in telephone contact with a clerical judge who could endorse, let's say, 10 or 20 or 30 lashes. And this, of course, was not revealed, this process, until much of the memoirs came out. But there is also, it's sort of verified inadvertently by one of the chief prosecutors, Ray Shari, in his memoirs, where he talks about the legitimate use of what he calls discretionary punishments. Interestingly enough, for much of the time, often there would be doctors around in case the prisoner, in fact, got seriously ill, because the last thing they wanted really was a dead prisoner. That would lose the whole purpose of the procedure. The idea was to get a confession, especially on video, rather than to have a dead body in your hands. Of course, many died, but often I think it's more due to mistakes rather than by intention. Not surprisingly, Haji Lajevardi, who was the main warden of Evin prison, boasted that 95% of his guests ended up providing him with the required videotape interviews. And even if the videotapes were not broadcast, they were filed for future use if necessary. And in fact, even after the 1990s, when these videos were not put on television, they were still used in the judicial process to convict people, because the evidence there of confession was seen as legitimate evidence and to bring in court. Ganji, one of the liberal reformers now. Himself a former staunch Khomeinist who spent 7 years in prison, has coined and popularized the brand new term, Tavop Sazi, manufacturing repentance. A play, of course, on the regime's own term of manufacturing citizens or manufacturing good Muslim. Ganji himself insists that, quote, prisoners who gave up should not be regarded negatively and should be defended as heroes, while the criminal regimes that employ such methods should be condemned. Again, a big cultural shift from the age of heroism of the pre-79. I think the net result is of this awareness of what goes on. A confession now is not associated with truth. It's actually automatically linked to torture. And once this link is made, of course, then the whole spell of a confession is broken, and the victim obtains sympathy, and the people who are actually bringing the show are then seen in a bad light as inhumane and brutal. The whole procedure of public recantations has got, I think, a final nail in its coffin by a satirist, Ibrahim Nabavi, in which he equated the prison conditions in the Republic to those of Stalinist Russia. Once out of prison, he has devoted his life to undermining the whole phenomena of public recantations in the best way possible, in the best way he knows, which is through satire. In a series of parodies, which you can actually watch on YouTube if you want, he impersonates prominent figures, and he confesses to a host of crimes, including plotting to overthrow the regime, working with the CIA, and having a series of love affairs, including with Marilyn Monroe, Madonna, Angelina Jolie, Carla Bruni, and Sophia Loren. He ends his last confession by thanking the wardens for, quote, lifting the veil from my eyes, letting me see the light, and, quote, kindly beating truth into his body. Now, the net result has been these public recantations have become increasingly counterproductive. The interrogators from the Ministry of Intelligence might continue to resort to torture to get so-called confessions, and the judiciary invariably uses such confessions to convict victims. But by the early 1980s, the regime, actually starting with the Rafsanjani administration, ceased using these recantations for public consumptions. It rightly came to the conclusion that such shows would be counterproductive, and they would reflect worse on the authorities than on the prisoners, and the audience would end up sympathizing more with the victims than the powers that be. The main the onus, you can say now, is on the regime that it has not used torture. In fact, it's quite likely that many of the people who were in the show trials in the last few months were not actually physically brutalized themselves. They were probably subjected to solitary confinement and told that they would never get out unless they cooperated. But the fact of the history of use of brutality means that people now take it for granted that these people were actually tortured, even if they were not tortured. So that the regime actually is in a bind there. They have to basically prove that they hadn't tortured, which is, of course, then very hard for them to do. But I'm not trying to put the regime in a good light, but I think from the earlier people we've had who've gone this experience, they were not actually physically tortured like in the 1980s, but much more subjected to terms of psychological torture and solitary confinement, rather than whipping or having their fingers broken and things like that did happen in the 1980s. Now, the main refrain and purpose of the 2009 recantations was to echo the official line that the West wanted a velvet revolution and the elections were fair and honest. And the mass protests of June 2009 were as a result of a Western conspiracy. So what comes out of these forced confessions is actually a sort of echo of the government claim. But as I said, because of the history of these previous confessions, these new linkings that the confessors make of presumably between Western interests and the protest movement ring very hollow. The worst damage actually these new confessions do is on a personal level of creating animosity between the various defendants. If one defendant, in fact, implicates another defendant, then obviously that causes resentment among the opposition figures. Many of them, in fact, tend to take the way out of pointing fingers or implicating people who are not in the country, who therefore can't get into trouble. But what the bottom line is, oh yes, there may have been a plot by the Soros to have a velvet revolution, but we didn't know about it, but we could have been unwitting party to such a thing, which is hardly a confession of committing a crime, but more of a confession of being an innocent victim to it. Consequently, the most personal damage that does is, in fact, of personal relationships. And this is very much reminiscent of a famous book entitled Naming Names by Viktor Navarsky. And this book was actually written about McCarthyism, about HUAC and the House Un-American Committee of the 1950s. These shows were also designed in part to reaffirm the gospel according to the authorities in America at the time, and were also designed to get the victims to humiliate themselves publicly by naming names. To conclude, history appears to have repeated itself in more ways than one. The public recantations of the 1980s were in many ways like the tragedy of the Stalinist trials, as many Western reporters noted at the time. But the recent show trials, or no-show trials, were not so much a repeat of the 1980s and 1930s, but as the press would have it, but are more like the farce of the McCarthyist Un-American Committee of the 1950s. They're despicable, grim, and sad, but more in the realm of parody and bad taste than of tragedy on a grand scale. I hope I didn't go over time.
No, this is fine. 20 minutes will be good.
Good.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abrahamian, for this contextualization of show trials. We do have 20 minutes for questions, and so if you would please line up at the microphones that we have in the aisles, and we'll simply move from one microphone to the other. It'll take them a while to decide who goes first. And we'll just move from one to
the other. Hi, I guess my main question is that when I'm comparing is the voice good? Yeah. When I'm comparing the show trials of the years right after the evolution and the one in 2009, the most important difference that comes to my mind is that in the 2009 version of the show trials, there were other accused people in the court who were not physically in the court, like Max Weber or or John Keats of England and other prominent human scientists. So my question is that if we want to evaluate the minds of the leaders of regime, what is the scariest thing in their mind? So they have two main criticizers. They have the Ayatollahs in Rome, like Montazeri and Sanei, who are saying what you do in this court is actually not is against the religion itself. And we have another version of the criticizers who are Max Weber or John Keats of the Western intellectuals. So what is the scariest thing that causes the regime to run these show trials? Is it because they are scared that they be accused of doing stuff unreligiously, or is it because they're afraid of the modern humanism of the West?
Well, I think it's mostly a decision made by the president and his supporters in the Ministry of Intelligence. And I think what they're doing is, as I said, sort of like a knee-jerk reaction. This was done before. And if their argument is that their opposition to them, the mass protests, were in fact done by part of the Velvet Revolution, you can't prove evidence. But if you get people actually repeating what you're saying, then is for them proof that I'm true. What I've said is true. Why? Because here, there are people from the opposition who oppose me are saying the same thing. So if you echo what the government says, then that's a verification of what the official view is. But then that only works if people are willingly saying that. If it's the idea that they're coerced to saying that, of course, then it doesn't work. I don't think that the show trials are designed for the clerics or anyone within the regime. It's really for the public to actually convince the public that this is a foreign-inspired protest. And part of what they also say often in the campaign, that the election was legitimate, that the figures was correct, and so on. So they're basically echoing what the government's claim about the protests were.
So what has changed in this government that back 30 years ago in the public, in television, Dr. Soroush debates against Tabari as a Marxist, and after 30 years, they're so afraid of Max Weber, who's already dead, and other Western human scientists. So what has changed the government that finds himself so weak in mentality and in the doctrine of the stuff that they're claiming to have, and apparently there's nothing there.
So your question is why they was scared of Max Weber?
Yeah. So why 30 years ago they had public television shows where Dr. Soroush sits there and Tabari sits there, and the Islamists consider themselves so strong in responding to the questions that Tabari was proposing, and after 30 years they are so afraid of now we see that Khamenei comes into the television and says the Western humanism is not good for us. We should not teach that anymore. We are looking for the second cultural evolution. So what has changed in the government that now they are in such a weak position in terms of having a doctrine? Well, they're claiming to want to run the whole world.
Well, it's not necessarily a weak position. It's their concern that, in fact, the new ideas of the reform movement, which are obviously are influenced by Habermas, could be seen from Ahmadinejad's point of view as a threat. So it's not just imaginary, but in sort of looking it from outside, obviously, Marx seems to be much more of a threat than Max Weber or Habermas. But from their point of view, they could equally be a serious threat. I mean, not only that, but also the other isms they used.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, sir. My question is in regards to the 1980s. You compared the 1980s confessions and compared them to the most early ones, the latest ones actually. And I was just noticing that there was that if you could please emphasize on maybe the war effort, on how it did affect, or if it did. And was there any backsteps, or was the war any negative influence on these show trials or confessions? And has the regime taken any notes on that, or has it changed the regime's perception or attitude because of the war that was going on? I just wanted to see the connection between the two, if you have any of that. Thank you.
Well, of course, the war effort created more of insecurity. I would add that sort of increased the paranoia that the republic was in danger. So in that context, that there was a greater both insecurity and that would, by getting ideological conformity, would be much more required at that time. And of course, once the war ends, that outside threat that congeals the republic is no longer there. So then the reasons diminish for confessions, at least public shows after 1989.
Is there anything that supports that these were kind of pushing the public mass to contribute more to the war effort without questioning the morals? Because the war was kind of a silencing tool used at that time. That you were called a traitor just because you were disagreeing with the government's doing, and I just people were not necessarily political during the war, and they were using the war as an excuse. That was my understanding. I mean, would the confessions and all that be a tool used to kind of throw off the public perception of these, for the attitude behind the real trials?
Well, the war obviously brought the country together. So in that situation, if you're openly critical of the government, you're more vulnerable. So a public confession then would fit it into that atmosphere. But I'm not sure the confessions were necessary. They were a different issue why the confessions were done. The country would still have rallied under the republic if there were confessions or not, because people didn't want to be invaded by Iraq. That's sort of the main impetus, was the foreign invasion.
Thank you.
It's my turn?
Yes. On the right
okay.
here, please.
Hi. Do you think the future of Iran could be something like a French Revolution because of 30 years of brutal religious government, which banned people from their basic rights, basic human rights, do you think because the demand of separation of religion from state, the strength of women's movement, and unions in Iran, and like secular movement, and you see the demand of people are very secular, and whoever comes to power in Iran, do you think it's going to be an example such as like French Revolution that happened 200 years ago in France? Can Iran be example for Middle East that get rid of this religious, political religious government, which not in Iran, the whole Middle East have been affected for the last 30 years. Do you see that potential? Because I think the people of Middle East are suffering from, like the Islamic reactionary power in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. And they have been able to expand their power over there. Do you think Iran could be the first place or the place that can actually, like get rid of this like barbaric movement and start a new, fresh, secular government or, country. Do you see that?
Well, I mean, the implication of what I was saying is the regime now is much weaker ideologically than it was in the 1980s, and you can see this in the way how these confessions work with the public. They don't have that attraction they had in the 80s. But to jump from that to claim that the regime is about to collapse and unravel and the dawn of freedom is about to come is a very different, big jump. So it's not a jump I would make. So that's a different question. And I would need about an hour to try to explain whether why the regime is not about to disappear, unfortunately.
Okay.
If I might remind you, if you have any questions, it would be best if you could walk up to the microphone where other people can hear them.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yes. I have a basic question. Why did this revolution happen? Since I was a child, I remember I was hearing all the time from my father and uncles that there is a very famous expression, if you take the part of mullahs, it's written here, made in England. Why did it happen? I mean, illiterate people didn't know who they were, but our intellectuals knew very well who the Akhunds were. What happened that they believed Khomeini?
For those of you who didn't hear the question, it was in brief, it wasn't why did the revolution happen, it was why did it and how did it become Islamic, I think. Okay, you want to try that one? Good luck.
I think
Thank you.
I think the stock answer for a big question like that is Mao Zedong gave it to, I think, Kissinger. Kissinger, I think, was asked him what he thought of the French Revolution, and the reply was, it's too early to tell.
It's a very, very good question, but perhaps we can move to the next one.
Could you actually speak up? The sound is not coming too well.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yeah, now we
Hear me? Yes. I have a comment and a question. The comment is recently in Iran, the letter of Galila, which was in a prison, has been widely translated and distributed, which he says, the earth, I made a mistake. Earth does not go around the sun, which is opposite. Sun goes around the earth. And what I said in prisons, it was wrong, and I apologize for that. And you don't think I wrote that because I was tortured. So, I mean, Iranians are sending those messages of the show trial in a different way. That shows, Galila was right, Earth goes around the sun. But, it shows how people are sending that message of this show trial, because people are in show trial are really under the torture, are saying what they say, so it shows how this message is getting around. And then my question is, how do you see the role of the Facebook and internet and Twitter in that show trial? Because if we did have these things in 1980s and 1930, I think it could be much different, because now the things comes out much sooner than in 1980s. In 1980s they murdered, executed 4,000 people, but many people didn't know that is happening because there was no Twitter, there was no internet. I mean, today anything happens, you knew anywhere in the world, in 1 minute what happens. So how you see that role? And then other question is, that show trial did not help the regime. So you think they will continue to do that show trial even if it didn't help them? They can see themselves it did not help them. It just backlashed, and so how you see that? I mean, it did not help them. So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, the internet question, I was going to mention that in the talk. I overlooked it. Internet plays a major, important role in getting a lot of the information from the 1980s out later. For instance, the memoirs that were written in the late 1980s, especially in Germany, Scandinavia, once internet becomes popularized, a lot of that information is now put on internet. So former political prisoners have a lot of websites you can see, memoirs, letters and stuff. And of course, people in Iran have access to that. So a lot of that information isn't kept just in Europe in exile, it filters in. Now, whether I think they will continue the show trials, I think that it's probably already ended. They've given the sentences, and it's very unlikely. What they will do is, if they convict other people, it will be closed courts where confessions will be used as evidence to convict people, but it won't be used as actually public performances for convincing the public of their rights. So I think that's they've realized that that's no good. It's actually, in a way, they've gone to the Rafsanjani period, because in that period also the Rafsanjani administration was savvy enough to realize that these public confessions were actually counterproductive. And we know a lot of cases where people were tortured to confess, but those videos were never aired. People like Sirjani was forced to confess. He died in prison, but it was never aired publicly.
Dr. Abrahamian, it's an honor to have you here. My question relates to your discussion about how the recent show trials are similar to the show trials in McCarthy in 1950s. Now, my question is, how can one be able to make this connection when, as recently as 3 weeks ago, there was an announcement that 3 individuals are going to be executed, and that Mehdi Karoubi, who's a clergy in Iran and obviously in a clergy in Iran, has made accusations of rape in the Iranian prisons. So I was wondering, how can one make this connection of this show trials to the more softer or less brutal show trials that existed during McCarthy era in the 1950s?
Yeah, I think you have to separate the main show trials, which were all basically prominent figures from the reform movement, and they were clearly the targets of the show trials. When what they did is they then threw in, for basically good measure, a few people who really had nothing to do with this. The people probably they had picked up from demonstrations, and people they didn't even name, but obviously either Mujahideen supporters and monarchists, basically to muddy the waters, so that in the public image, these reformers who are part of the establishment could be tarred with the Mujahideen or monarchists. So it's a sort of use of, I would say, association, and the innocent viewer would say, look, they are linked, although, of course, there's no link. So I think that's where the explanation is. And those basically people picked up in demonstrations have probably nothing to do with the reform movement. They may have been involved in basically fighting with the Basijans, things like that. So they're sort of used as an example, but it's not really part of the show trial. It would be like in any previous demonstrations where people were shot or then executed, but were not put on a big show trial. But the main gist of the show trials, the prominent reformers humiliating themselves, That's where I think this parallels with HUAC come. And of course, HUAC was not always that benign. Plenty of people died as a result of HUAC, having basically committed suicide.
Thank you.
Are both of you are there two in line there? Yeah, and one here. Let's have these three questions, and we'll have those the last. Is that fine for you? Thank you. You first.
Hello. Your lecture solidified that the 09 confessions were not performing or are not performing a function of a raison d'être, if you will, and instigating a backlash both domestically and internationally. Now this brings me to the question of why it is that they're happening and what purpose they're serving. If I may, I'd like to just propose two hypotheses which I've been thinking about myself, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. The first is, perhaps as an explanation, a Weberian notion of bureaucratic competition, where we have institutions that need to fill their functions in order to survive. So a kind of, a political governmentality, if you will. A second is a maybe Foucauldian, Schmittian spectacle of sovereignty being performed in Iran. So kind of shifting towards a disciplinary society. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I know it's a bit much.
Well, you can always, as a Weberian, find functions for everything, but if the intention of the regime is to function efficiently, then it would make sense not to have the show trials. This is counterproductive. So if it's a pure rational decision by, I would say, cool-headed people, it's not functional. Whether it's disciplinary, I don't know if watching people who are dressed in pajamas humiliating themselves actually creates discipline or revulsion. It might actually be more for the audience creating more of a revulsion against the regime for putting on a show like this. The discipline could only work if there's actually real terror. And since that isn't there, I doubt whether it has a disciplinary effect. After all, Foucault is talking about real pain on the scaffold, frightening people, and that I don't think is happening, and it actually, in Iran, it wouldn't work. It would, I think, create more of a revulsion and backlash.
So any thoughts on what the possible purpose of these?
What are the possible?
What the possible purpose of these show trials could be? What function they're serving?
Well, it's partly, I think, sort of the knee-jerk reaction. If this is what the regime did before, and it succeeded, so their automatic reaction is, let's go back and do that way it worked before. History repeating itself without the regime realizing that the situation is very different. They're not in tune with changes that have taken place. And here, of course, then you have to look at personnel, because earlier regimes, administrations like the Rafsanjani administration, hardly a liberal one, but they were savvy enough not to use this. But the present conservative administration, I don't think, is sophisticated enough. So it often boils down to, I think, in terms of how sophisticated the decision makers are.
We'll have the question on the right here, and then again here, and we'll end with that.
I was a little bit kind of surprised at the use of Marx, and mostly because, though I respect Marx very much, and certainly you as well, that he was being frivolous, and that the show trials you quite accurately described as farce, but I don't know that the situation is comparable to the American situation either. That underneath all of that there were people being killed in the street, or there was real tragedy in Iran, and in the United States there were real tragedies in the political protests that preceded McCarthyism. And my question comes from my sense of what happened in the United States was that McCarthyism produced a generation of red diaper babies that went on to occupy Columbia University and lead massive demonstrations against the Vietnamese War. I don't know that you can predict very easily, but that your description of the show trials is almost as if the government has become itself post-structuralist, that nothing means anything very much anymore, and will just do the trials publicly, and they don't mean anything to anybody, and that will somehow cover over the real meaning in the blood in the streets. And I somehow suspect that already some drastic change has taken place in the structure of Iran, if not a fall of the government. Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I didn't want to minimize, of course, the tragedy happening outside. I was just, when I was talking about farce, I was talking about the actual show, the trial, not what's happening in the streets. And of course, when Marx was talking about France at that time, similarly, very violent things were happening in the streets too. But it's, I think if you're trying to talk about the whole structure of what the regime is doing, there's some incoherence because I think there is division in the regime of what should be done. I think what the intention of those who were really eager to have the show trials, Ahmadinejad, was to link the people in the trial with the main opposition leaders, Karoubi and Mousavi. So that to say, well, this foreign conspiracy actually was done with their knowledge, so that he was really after them. But there were others in the regime, including Supreme Leader, who probably didn't want to go that far. And that, therefore, resulted in a sort of half-cock about what was going on. And that, is, I think, partly explains the incoherence. So if one is looking for sort of a rational, systematic policy, it doesn't fit because there are these divisions.
Yes, when we talk about public trials, it is for public. And probably regime was targeting part of public that it's its own basis with these trials, because if we consider that maybe 50%, 45, 60, I don't know how many percent, did vote for Ahmadinejad. And after that, we had this fiasco, I mean, this, the whole events after that. The regime needed some kind of excuse or some kind of legitimizing the whole process of people not, our the demonstration and everything. Based on that, they tried to have these show trials in order to convince their own basis, maybe that it was kind of foreign-aided demonstration and things like that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, if the show trials are sort of done directly for Ahmadinejad's core constituency, let's say there's probably a good 25% of the electorate forms the hardcore constituency of Ahmadinejad. It would, of course, reinforce their view that the protests were American-inspired. But that then has to be taken into fact that if it reinforces that base, it supports the base, it can also end up alienating more the rest of the population that is not Ahmadinejad support. So it actually, the show trials then could end up polarizing more the public than actually winning over people to support the regime. But after all, the show trial is supposed to win over people to your side. But if it actually ends up creating more of antagonism and polarizing the population, then it's again counterproductive.
Yeah, I guess the society was already polarized, but maybe, I don't know, but it seemed like when you talk about public, you're targeting part of public, so, well, I guess you're right, you know. I don't know, it's just that that's a point to think about, because I don't know how many percent voted for really Ahmadinejad. Maybe, I don't know if it's 25%, 30, 35, whatever. But they needed some kind of convincing that this was something from abroad, you know, that the whole demonstrations.
Yeah, I mean, we know from previous elections that there's a good 25%. It's the hardcore of the conservatives. So they would vote for a conservative candidate, short of the conservative candidate claiming that there's no God or something, that they would automatically support the conservative candidate. So that audience would be much more open to the argument that the protests were foreign inspired. But I would have thought the other 75% who is more skeptical or reform-minded, for that 75%, the show trials are basically counterproductive.
Thank you.